Political Islam is Islam. There's no difference. It's just a narrative that they're selling you. They've been selling you this narrative for a long time. And the governments of Europe that are now pretending to listen to the nations of Europe and pretending to adopt measures to fight the Muslim invasion of Europe are lying to the nations of Europe because they're telling them that they're going to fight political Islam. There's no such thing. We're going to explain it tonight. This is the English language podcast of Management of Reality. I am Francisco Gil White. I am an anthropologist, and this is our 6th August 2026 podcast. All right, so let's get into it. So there's been this narrative ever since the woke movement, or the precursor to the woke movement, began strangling the left, the Western left, and becoming sort of the dominant institutional ideology. Ever since that has been happening, and that begins with the new left, right? So this begins in the 1960s with the new left. And the new left is what later became woke. So woke is a development of the new left, okay? Identity politics, all this stuff. That comes out of the new left, which begins in the 1960s. And it was simultaneous with that this apology for Islam began, okay? Not all at once, not as strong in the beginning as it later became, but they started doing this. Now, and eventually it became mainstream, and then after that, obligatory to say nice things about Islam in the West, especially in the academic setting. And you had to always you had to have this careful sort of grammatically required phrasing to always say that violence in Islam was a violation of the core principles of Islam, and therefore the violent jihadis who want to kill infidels and so forth were supposedly violating the true message, the core message of Islam, which is supposed to be peace, right? So there was this chorus, this constant refrain about Islam being the religion of peace, and therefore violent Muslims being radicals who are betraying the true core message of Islam. Okay. Now, why should it be simultaneous? Why should it be that when the new left gains ground and becomes institutionalized in the media and in the universities and in every bureaucracy, private or public, in the West, which is what happened because the university graduates that were groomed by these cultural Marxists in Western universities, right? They were groomed, they were indoctrinated, and as they graduated from university, well, they became managers everywhere. This is what one of the leaders of the 60s movement, a German guy, Duchke, I think was his name, he coined this phrase, the long march through the institutions. You see, because it was obvious to them that they would win eventually. If the professors at the university are cultural Marxists and they are grooming their impressionable students and giving them a value system and a worldview, which I'm calling the new left. Everybody calls it the new left. So they're giving them this new worldview, this new set of values. Well, the people with university training are the people who become the managers in every single bureaucratic institutional setting in the West, whether public or private. The people with university degrees, those are the managers. So they're good. So what was very obvious to a lot of people, even at the very beginning of this, was that it was just a matter of time before the West was transformed. because all of these people who were being indicted in this new ideology were going to be in power very soon, everywhere. And now they are. Now they are. This is why the West is being destroyed, right? So the question is, why should it be that with the new left, you get, as the new left is institutionalized, you get this institutionalized apology for Islam? And the answer is because I'm going to explain what Islam is in a second, and you'll see that all this stuff about the religion of peace is just false, right? But the reason they had to lie about Islam is that the system of values that was inculcated, indoctrinated, groomed into the impressionable university students, generation after generation for the last 60 years, is a value system and a worldview that told them that the West was bad and white people were bad because they had been colonialists and imperialists. And brown and black people were good, morally good, because they had been the victims of imperialists and colonizers. And redemption for the world is exacting some kind of vengeance from white people and from the West for their former victims in the global South or the third world, or however you want to call that. And redemption for white people and for the West as a whole would be always apologizing and paying reparations to the former victims of colonialism and European colonialism and imperialism. Okay, that's sort of the worldview and the value system that was given to them. And under this frame, which short circuits ethical reasoning because it's no longer reasoning, right? You're just putting people in boxes on the basis of identity. This is identity politics. White bad. If you have a white identity, you are automatically described and considered bad. Obviously, this is racist, but identity politics is racist. And if you are brown or black, then by definition, by category, you are good. This is how woke identity politics works, right? So what that means is that all of these white wokesters in the West are going to be seeking their own redemption by apologizing and seeking to pacify and to genuflect towards black and brown people from parts of the world that were colonized by European powers in centuries past. Okay. So grammatically, what this requires is that you submerge everything that is ethically outrageous about the Muslim religion, because the brown people who were colonized by white European powers in Western Asia and North Africa, well, those people are all Muslims. So if those people are now automatically good because they were once colonized and because they're brown or black, if that's what makes them good, then in order to keep saying that they're good, you're going to have to submerge everything that is ethically outrageous about Islam. Because otherwise, the hypothesis that their violence is not resistance to Western domination, that their violence is not really revenge for past insults or for past oppression, the hypothesis that their violence is in fact internally generated from the ideological system of their religion, right? That hypothesis will remain alive if people are honest about the ideological content of Islam. So in order to sustain this woke worldview, where the brown and black peoples of the world are automatically good just because they were once colonized, which is of course idiotic, but this is what This is what is this is the package. This is the woke package, which short circuits reasoning about anything. Okay, it's just categories. It's identities, identity politics. Once you do this, you have to submerge. You have to submerge the truth about Islam, because Islam is just horrendous. Okay, and we're going to talk about the content of Islam now, so that you can see what I'm talking about. And you need to understand this, because you need to understand what the West is facing, what the threat to the West is, and let us say the management of reality aspect of that threat. The core of that threat is a combination of two things. It's the apology for Islam, so that you'll learn to apologize for the violence of Muslims as a reaction to Western oppression, right? Supposedly we are guilty for their violence, so we can't really defend ourselves from it, because this ideology is justifying it. Okay, so that's one pillar. The other pillar is they keep defining Islam as a religion. Okay, and what that activates in the brain of the modern Westerner is protected category. The minute you call something a religion, in the grammar of the modern liberal democratic West, you've turned it into a protective category, because the ideology of the constitutional, democratic, participatory, suffragist, etc., ideology of of modern Westerners, right? The democratic ideology of modern Westerners has as one of its core principles freedom of religion. So if you keep calling Islam a religion, you will automatically, grammatically activate in every good Westerner who wants to think of him or herself as a liberal Democrat, right? You activate a desire to protect the right to worship, to protect the right to have your own book, your own set of beliefs, your own religious customs, to have your nonprofit temples and charities and so forth, right? All of that because a pillar of our understanding of what a modern democracy is freedom of religion. So these are the two pillars with which they manipulate you. They call Islam a religion, which of course in some senses it is. But what I'm saying is insisting on that interpretation for political purposes activates that consequence. It's important to see that. And the other pillar is this apology for Islam, where the actual content of Islam is submerged in this false narrative about the religion of peace and the fringe radicals and so forth of the jihadists as fringe radicals. That narrative is also imposed on you. Okay, so those are the two pillars of how reality is managed. Now the way to counter this, I always tell people the way to get freed from this is to read the Quran. Read the Quran. Read it. Don't let other people tell you what's in it. It's not a very long book. It's not going to take you a long time. It's rather thin. It's very boring. That's what's going to make it difficult to get through. It is not profound. It is really quite superficial and devoid of any real profundity. Mostly, it is negative, very strongly derogatory, and even violent language against Jews and Christians. That's what most of the Quran is. Why Jews and Christians are wrong and bad, and why, if they won't convert to Islam, Muslims should kill them. Or perhaps let them live if they agree to sign the contract of the Dima, which turns Jews and Christians into dhimmis, which is the Muslims are fond of saying that that's a protected status. But it's true in the sense of a protection racket, because if you sign the contract of the Dima, which turns you into a semi-slave of the Muslims, as a Jew or as a Christian, then you can live among them as a dhimmi, which means they'll let you live as a semi-slave So in a sense, they have protected you from them because they were going to exterminate you. So it's a kind of a protection racket. So you are a protected status in that sense. So when they tell you that Jews and Christians in the history of Islam were protected peoples, okay, because they'll tell you that, that's how you should interpret it. That's what it means. It means protection racket. It doesn't mean protected category in the language that we use in the modern democratic West. So the way to counter this is to read the Quran. I recommend the translation done by Yusuf Ali. Yusuf Ali made a very famous translation towards the end of the 19th century, last decade of the 19th century, if I remember correctly. That's the one I use. I have 3 different translations, but the one I use is Yusuf. I don't speak Arabic, but Yusuf Ali made his translation of the Quran to English at a time when there was no pressure of political correctness to make Islam look like something that would be acceptable to a modern democratic Judeo-Christian. There was no such pressure at the end of the 19th century. Yusuf Ali was a proud Muslim who thought the Quran was fine the way it was. And he wanted Westerners to be able to understand the content because he wanted to make converts to Islam. And it's a faithful translation. It's an honest attempt to render the meaning of the Arabic in English. So because there were no pressures of political correctness, you can see clearly in Yusuf Ali's translation just how violent the Quran really is. And you can find it online. It's not difficult to find Yusuf Ali's translation online. You can buy it on Kindle in Amazon. It's available. So it's not a problem. Go read it. Go read it. And what I will do today is I will talk about the content of the ideology of Islam from the point of view of the Muslim jurists. In other words, I don't want you to think that I'm saying things about Islam that are not sanctioned by the authorities that the Muslims recognize as the experts and the institutionalized offices for interpreting the sacred books of Islam. Okay, I'm not going to say anything about Islam that the highest authorities within the juridical, political, religious system of Islam accept as true. I will only say things that they accept as true, and in fact, I'm going to be quoting them. Okay. But first, I want to quote some of the things that Westerners have been telling you about Islam. People that in the West are considered authorities, and messages that are clearly directed from the very, very top of the Western institutional system to Westerners about how ordinary Westerners should think about Islam, and that they should be ashamed to think about Islam in any other way, because that would be what? Islamophobia, right? So that's the third pillar. I forgot the third pillar. The third pillar was to recruit, let's just say very briefly, to recruit the entire language of racism, which I think not being a racist is a great thing. I'm all for it, right? But what they did in the woke ideology is they recruited the beauty of combating racism, which we all should do, but they recruited that to turn it on its head, right? So they tell you that if you're afraid of Islam, you're an Islamophobe. That if you're against Islam, you're an Islamophobe. That if you don't want a Muslim invasion of the West, you are an Islamophobe. You suffer from a mental disorder because you have a phobia, right? I mean, a phobia. So think about an arachnophobia. Arachnophobia means that your fear of spiders is out of all proportion to the danger that spiders actually represent. So somebody who sees a spider on the other side of the room and starts shrieking and jumping on the furniture and tearing their hair out and losing it, well, that's an arachnophobe. Okay, and we call it we categorize it as a mental problem because insanity is by definition losing contact with reality. So if your reaction to the danger represented by a spider is out of all proportion to the actual danger, you're having trouble making contact with reality. That's why we call it a phobia. It's a form of insanity. Okay, there's many kinds of phobias. I was once looking at a catalog of phobias. It's amazing. There are people who suffer from phobia of large words. They have panic attacks with long words or whatever. There are people who have phobia of hair, of human hair. I mean, there are all kinds of different phobias, okay? And they're all forms of insanity. So when they tell you that you are an Islamophobe, they are calling you insane. The implication is that if you're opposed to Islam or you're afraid of Islam, then you are having a reaction that is out of all proportion to the danger that Islam actually represents. That's what they're telling you. And they support that with the other pillar, right? Because they're telling you with the other pillar that Islam is the religion of peace. So obviously, if Islam is the religion of peace and you're afraid of Islam, you must be an Islamophobe. Your reaction is out of all proportion to the actual danger. You're not making contact with reality. This is what they're trying to tell you. Okay, that's what the word Islamophobe was created to represent, and it is collapsed into other terms that are used in the language of analyzing racism. So people talk about anti-Semitism as being synonymous with Judeophobia. That's another term that they use. So Islamophobia is meant to be analogous to Judeophobia, which of course is a phobia, because the Jews not only don't represent a danger to the peoples of the world, they are a great blessing to the peoples of the world, as has been demonstrated many times. And every time that great mass killings of Jews are organized, it turns out that it is very easy to do. Like in World War II, it was very easy to kill the Jews. The institutions of the West all collaborated with the killing of the Jews, right? So obviously being afraid of Jews, that's a phobia. You can kill them very easily on the one hand. And on the other hand, they've been a great blessing to the world. How do we know that they're a great blessing? Well, look, I can give you many statistics, but I'll give you just one. It only takes 200,000 Jews to hand out 3 Nobel Prizes. That's all you need. To hand out 3 Nobel Prizes, you're going to need, I think it was 11 million Christians. And to hand out 3 Nobel Prizes, you're going to need something like 450 million Muslims. Those are pretty big differences, right? Those are orders of magnitude differences. So the Nobel Prizes are defined. Alfred Nobel defined the condition for handing out a Nobel Prize as whoever has benefited humanity the most in the previous year, right? That's how you know who's supposed to get that's the criterion for choosing the recipient of the Nobel Prize. Well, nobody gets more of those than the Jews. Nobody's even close. Right? So they are the people most benefiting humankind on the one hand. On the other hand, very easy to kill. So if you're afraid of the Jews, you are insane. Anti-Semitism really is a phobia. Now, what about the Islam? Okay, let's get into it. We'll see. I'll let you decide. So we have, for example, Pope Benedict XVI. In December 2006, Pope Benedict XVI made a trip to Istanbul, the capital of Turkey, governed for many years now by the jihadists, Erdogan's jihadists. And what Pope Benedict XVI did is he went inside the Blue Mosque, the famous Blue Mosque, and prayed in the direction of Mecca, took his shoes off, went inside the mosque, and prayed in the direction of Mecca under the instruction of a Muslim cleric. And of course, in the media, this is represented as, oh, he's being ecumenical and bringing the faiths together, etc. But this can only be argued. That narrative can only work if people don't understand what the content of Islam is. Because if they had told you, oh, the Pope went into the headquarters of the Nazi Party and he sat down with the Nazi leaders and they all prayed together about the coming world order, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's bad because you know what a German Nazi is, right? So the only way to spin the story that the Pope is doing something good for the world, trying to produce cooperation between the Catholic Church and the authorities of Islam, the only way to spin that as something positive is if you don't know the content of Islam. That's the argument I will make, okay? Because if you do know it, your reaction would be the same as if that you had been told that the Pope went to the Nazi headquarters and sat down to have a productive chat with the Nazi leaders about joining together, right? If that's the conversation. All right, so at least in times past, this was well understood in the West. It was well understood that Islam was very dangerous to the values of the West. And if a priest in the Middle Ages had done what the Pope did, what Pope Benedict XVI did, they might have burned him alive at the stake, as a heretic. So obviously something has definitely changed in the Catholic Church, right? I ran an experiment some years ago. This is in the year 2007. I asked the LexisNexis database, which is a database that aggregates, among other things, the archives of many different newspapers from all over the West. And so I asked LexisNexis to look for the word Islam within 10 words, because you can do that, within 10 words of the phrase religion of peace. Okay, remember, this is 2007. And the answer was 738 results. So it found 738 instances of Islam appearing within 10 words of the phrase religion of peace. And then I asked the same database to look for the word Islam within 10 words of the phrase religion of war. This time I got only 66 results. This means that Westerners hear in the mainstream mass media that Islam is a religion of peace more than 11 times more often than they hear the opposite argument. And I should point out that many of those 66 results about Islam being close to the phrase religion of war, most of those were about how specific individuals got in trouble for saying that Islam was a religion of war. So the ratio of characterizations of Islam as a religion of peace versus characterizations of Islam as a religion of war is even more lopsided than 11 times more. Okay? But even 11 times is already quite dramatic. Now, if we accept the common media representation of Islam, then those Muslims who quite obviously and openly preach war cannot be true or orthodox Muslims. And that is, as I've been saying, why we encounter these special terms that get invented. On the one hand, Islamophobia, and on the other hand, terms like fundamentalist Islam, radical Islam, Islamofascism, Islamism, Islamist terrorism. Those terms were all invented to make a distinction between violent Islam and allegedly true Islam. Okay? So by logical necessity, under this interpretation, the term moderate Islam is supposed to refer to the Muslims who do adhere to the traditional orthodox and allegedly true nature of Islam, which in this view is peace, right? Now, when Pope Benedict went to pray at the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, he made the claim, he spoke to the media and he called Islam, and I quote, this is him speaking, quote, a religion of peace, tolerance, and love, end of quote. So that was Pope Benedict XVI, the head of the World Catholic Church, vouching for Islam, called it a religion of peace, tolerance, and love, quote unquote. Now, certainly Pope Benedict XVI is entitled to his own opinion. I would never say otherwise. But he is not a Muslim cleric or scholar. So before we commit ourselves to an interpretation, it is probably wise to at least consult the recognized Muslim authorities on what the mission of Islam is supposed to be. If the interpretation of these Muslim authorities agrees with Pope Benedict, fine. But if it doesn't, I think it's nonsense to privilege the views on Islam of the Pope over the views on Islam of the Muslim authorities. So I think we should really take seriously what Muslim authorities have been telling millions of Muslims over the ages, what Islam is supposed to be. So let me first characterize not just what the Pope is doing, but the entire media, and then we will go to the Muslim authorities. Okay, so first, what does the word jihad mean? These days, it is common for the mass media to present us with Muslims who defend the view that jihad, and they'll interview them in different programs and in NPR, with soft voices and really good microphones, and they'll talk to a soft-spoken Muslim who explains how peaceful Islam is supposed to be, and the interviewer is always a friendly interviewer, trying to understand why it has been mischaracterized and why some people deviate from the beautiful core of Islam and so forth, right? And in these conversations, you are always told that jihad, although it can be translated as holy war, can also have many different meanings. And the primary meaning, you are told, of the word jihad has nothing to do with violence. Naturally, because Islam is the religion of peace. So, for example, I'm quoting now from an article that was published in the South China Morning Post, which is a Hong Kong newspaper. The author, Riaz Hassan, and I quote, says, jihad can be viewed as a revolutionary process in stages, proceeding from the spiritual to the temporal realm of politics. This interpretation is counter to the prevailing conception in the West, which views jihad in terms of destruction and suffering inflicted by religious fanatics on civilian populations, end of quote. In other words, Hassan is saying that only Muslim, quote unquote, religious fanatics will use the word jihad to mean terrorism, quote, destruction and suffering inflicted on civilian populations, end of quote. According to him, the word really has primarily a, quote unquote, spiritual interpretation. Western public figures routinely endorse such arguments. For example, in 1993, in a speech at the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, where Charles, the Prince of Wales, now the King of Great Britain, is a patron of the Center for Islamic Studies. How about that? And at that place, the now King of England, then the Prince of Wales, said that, quote, the guiding principle and spirit of Islamic law, taken straight from the Quran, should be those of equity and compassion, end of quote. This is the King of England vouching for Islam, just like the head of the Catholic Church also vouching for Islam. I quote again, quote, the guiding principle and spirit of Islamic law, taken straight from the Quran, should be those of equity and compassion, end of quote. Strong stuff. Immediately after the terrorist attacks in New York on 11 September 2001, 9/11, which US President George W. Bush attributed to a self-consciously Muslim terrorist organization, I quote from the media, quote, President Bush joined American Muslim leaders to defend Islam as a religion of peace, not terrorism, unquote. It was very important for Bush to say to the US citizens and Westerners more generally, it was imperative immediately after a terrorist attack carried out by Muslims on innocent American citizens. It was imperative that Bush tell everyone that Islam is a religion of peace, not terrorism. I'm quoting. The President of the United States vouching for Islam, just like the head of the Catholic Church, just like the King of England, of Great Britain. Now, it is true that George W. Bush made his statement about Islam is the religion of peace surrounded by American Muslim leaders. That's true. But in the United States, Islam is a minority religion. And in the context of a terrorist attack for which that is being attributed to a self-consciously Muslim terrorist organization, a self-consciously jihadist organization, right? In that context, it's obviously politic for American Muslim leaders to agree publicly with Bush that, yes, Islam is the religion of peace. It will be instructive, therefore, to see what a Muslim cleric and scholar in a different context, in a majority Muslim country, says about Islam. I turn, therefore, to the late Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who led the creation of an Islamic Republic in Iran in 1979 and established what is called Iranian jihadism, the Ayatollah regime in Tehran. It's the one that is still running Iran to this day. On the question of whether Islam is a religion of peace, Khomeini expressed himself with great clarity in a speech entitled, Islam is not a religion of pacifists. That's the title of the essay. And the essay contains the following passage, and I quote, those who know nothing of Islam pretend that Islam counsels against war. Those who say this are witless. Islam says, kill all the unbelievers just as they would kill you all. Does this mean that Muslims should sit back until they are devoured by the unbelievers? Islam says, kill them, the non-Muslims. Put them to the sword and scatter their armies. Does this mean sitting back until non-Muslims overcome us? Islam says, kill in the service of Allah those who may want to kill you. Does this mean that we should surrender to the enemy? Islam says, whatever good there is exists thanks to the sword and in the shadow of the sword. People cannot be made obedient except with the sword. The sword is the key to paradise, which can be opened only for holy warriors. There are hundreds of other Quranic psalms and hadith sayings of Muhammad urging Muslims to value war and to fight. Does all this mean that Islam is a religion that prevents men from waging war? I spit upon those foolish souls who make such a claim. End of quote. I think that's very clear. According to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, revered in the entire Shia Muslim as a great interpreter of Quranic law, as a great interpreter of the core message of Islam for millions of Muslims, according to this guy, Islam is the religion of war. And it is very obvious to him that anybody saying otherwise doesn't have any idea what Islam is. All right. So it would appear that concerning the nature of Islam, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini disagrees with the head of the Catholic Church, the future King of England and the President of the United States. Benedict XVI says that Islam is a, quote, a religion of peace, tolerance, and love, end of quote. Prince Charles, claiming the authority of the Quran, says that Islam is about, quote, equity and compassion, end of quote. And George W. Bush, quote, defended Islam as a religion of peace, not terrorism, end of quote. But Khomeini called Islam a religion of war. He called for killing, quote, all the unbelievers, unquote, and he was a major sponsor of terrorism against unbelievers around the world. Of course, Khomeini has been called a fundamentalist, a fanatic, a radical, and an Islamist, which is supposed to mean that he does not represent mainstream Orthodox Islam. However, it is worth pointing out that unlike Pope Benedict, unlike Prince Charles, unlike President Bush, who are not even Muslims, Khomeini was a widely respected cleric and scholar within Islam. And it is worth noting also that Khomeini bases his views on the Quran and the sayings of Muhammad. In order to establish whether Khomeini was inside or outside what has traditionally been the Muslim mainstream, I shall now turn to the views of medieval Islamic scholars and see whether they are any different from Khomeini's. Then I will examine the views of modern Muslim authorities whom Western officials and the Western mass media have gone out of their way to praise as great moderates, and again test to see whether their views are at all different from Khomeini's. Done with that, I will examine how much room there is for interpreting Muhammad's legacy in order to produce that phenomenon we keep hearing about, moderate Islam. Okay, so let's begin with medieval Islam and its understanding of jihad. Medieval Islam, like modern Islam, was not a monolithic religion. There were sharp controversies, and different scholars defended contrasting views on many different points. I make this clear at the outset because whenever one talks about religion, accusations easily fly that one has painted with a broad brush and ignored the ideological diversity. But though we must be fair to the various views within Islam, we must also recognize that in a book-based religion, the sacred texts will tether the debates around a clear center of gravity. By measuring the distance that separates the various disputants, we can identify the point around which they all circle, thus recognizing the ideological diversity, but characterizing also the broad agreement that keeps the disputants in the same intellectual community. I will examine the views of Abu Muhammad Ali ibn Ahmad ibn Sa'id ibn Hazm, or Ibn Hazm, for mercy's sake, relying on the French scholar Roger Arnaldez, who wrote in 1962 an article entitled Holy War According to Ibn Hazm of Cordoba, where he examines the medieval jurist's views on the topic of jihad as expressed in his Kitab al-Muhalla. I have chosen Ibn Hazm because he was from a wealthy and politically powerful family in Muslim Cordoba, Spain. He was advisor to the caliphs of the imperial Umayyad dynasty in the 12th century, and he was one of the most prolific and influential theorists in Islam. Ibn Hazm was mainstream. Another reason Ibn Hazm is convenient is that he sought to write a polemic attacking the controversies that existed within Islam in his own time. Ibn Hazm, says Arnaldez, expresses, quote unquote, profound disgust for the Muslim society in which he lives. His, quote, purpose is to jolt and rouse a Muslim community that he considers to have fallen completely into religious decadence, end of quote. The mistaken interpretations of other Muslim scholars were, in Ibn Hazm's view, responsible for the sad state of Muslim society. And Ibn Hazm worked hard to refute these rival views. Thus, by examining Ibn Hazm's writings, we can see what distance separated his views from those of his opponents, and hence identify the intellectual center of gravity of medieval Islamic civilization. In order to follow the scholar Roger Arnaldez, my readers should know that Islam traditionally divides the world into two regions, Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. The first means the House of Islam, which is the region where Muslims are a majority and politically dominant. They're the government. And the second, Dar al-Harb, revealingly means the house of war. In other words, the rest of the world where Muslims are not yet dominant, Muslim civilization calls the house of war. Where Muslims are not yet dominant, Muslims must bring war. What did Ibn Hazm think about jihad? Quote, as for holy war, Arnaldus explains, it is clear that we do not find in Ibn Hazm's writings any attempt to spiritualize the notion. For him, the jihad remains essentially a war waged with arms. End of quote. Summarizing Ibn Hazm's philosophy, Arnaldus says, and I will now quote at length, quote, jihad is an obligation incumbent upon all Muslims, but when some of them fulfill it, drive back the enemy and bring war, Ghazwa, to his home territory, when they defend the frontier towns, the other Muslims, are relieved of this obligation. Nevertheless, in the case of an emergency, every believer who has no serious impediment can be called up to fight. The Muslim in the Dar al-Harb, the Muslim who lives as a minority in countries not yet dominated by Muslims, right? The Muslim in the Dar al-Harb who receives orders to fight must obey, unless he has a valid excuse. Ibn Hazm does not mean that the Muslims, even those who are in fact relieved of the obligation, should disassociate themselves from the jihad on the pretext that it is not a personal requirement in the highest degree. The texts that Ibn Hazm cites are typical of his concern for keeping all the believers, whether or not directly killing infidels, involved. The Quran, in many verses, insists on this duty. Offer your help, whether you have little or much weight. Wage jihad by enlisting your property and your persons. Now, Ibn Hazm says that this is a general command, since there is no one who is not either light or heavy. According to one hadith, quote, he who dies without having waged war, walam yagzu, or without having harbored the hope of doing so, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, walam yuhadith bil nafsahu, dies in a sort of hypocrisy. According to another, the Prophet Muhammad declared, quote, no abandonment of the cause after victory, but jihad in steadfast resolve, or niyyah. And if you are called, come to their aid. End of quote from Muhammad. It seems, therefore, that besides the war, strictly speaking, there is something like a permanent psychological preparedness for war. In this latent form, the jihad must not cease. End of quote from Roger Arnaldus. In other words, for Ibn Hazm, jihad is much more than armed combat against infidels to expand the frontiers of Dar al-Islam. Jihad is the total contribution that every Muslim makes all the time, in every way possible, accepting occasional valid excuses, toward the success of the permanent war waged on the line dividing Dar al-Islam from Dar al-Harb. Arnaldus cites what Ibn Hazm, basing himself on the Hadiths and the Quran, considers the Islamic obligations incumbent on non-combatants, and then makes the following comment, quote, this text is interesting because it shows the antiquity of a very broad concept of the jihad, which consists of making a fundamental commitment to obey God in everything, end of quote. The point of obeying God in everything is to maximize the probability of success for armed combat on the frontiers of Islam. One's whole life must be oriented towards this goal. As the scholar Jacques Ellul once observed, quote, jihad is an institution and not an event. That is, it is part of the normal functioning of the Muslim world, end of quote. The key point is this. In the context of what he writes, if Ibn Hazm was, quote unquote, profoundly disgusted with the Islamic society of his times, as he said he was, then he was upset that Muslims were going soft, distracting themselves from their supreme obligation, which is war. Now, since Ibn Hazm was influential, it follows that in medieval Islam, moderation was perceived to be heterodox, producing in reaction authoritative accusations of betrayal of Islam. But Arnaldez explains that for Ibn Hazm, quote, it is not enough to be a mercenary run amok in order to enter paradise, end of quote. That's not enough. Notice the phrasing. Arnaldez says, to enter paradise, it is not enough to be a mercenary run amok. The Muslim jurist Ibn Hazm took pains to clarify precisely how a good Muslim wages jihad by following the law in everything, even as he kills the infidel. Ibn Hazm wants the holy warrior, the jihadi holy warrior, to be pure, to be a good Muslim. And so against those who say that if two Muslims face three or more of the enemy, it is legal for them to flee, but not before, Ibn Hazm demonstrates with asperity that the Quranic verse on which his opponents base their affirmation has been interpreted in a frankly absurd, pseudo-literal manner. Islam does not specify any number. The Muslim must always err on the side of attack, even when the enemy's strength is far superior, retreating only when this is tactically advisable to wage a better battle. Ibn Hazm doesn't go so far as to defend an obligation to martyrdom, a suicidal attack, but he does make it clear that martyrdom is positively valued. Abu Bakr, another Muslim jurist, recommends not to cut any fruit trees or to destroy the cultivated lands of the enemy. Ibn Hazm replies that, quote, in enemy territory, it is permissible to burn the produce of the land, the trees and the vineyards, because the very Prophet Muhammad set fire to the palm groves of the Banu al-Nadir, a Jewish tribe of Medina, end of quote. But Abu Bakr is within his rights to make his recommendation, concedes Ibn Hazm, because there is not, in fact, an obligation to destroy everything, merely a permission to do so. And the decision in each particular case must be made by the commander. The great Malakite and Hanafite currents within Islam allow the killing of all of the domestic animals which the infidels possess, because, quote, war should bring destruction upon the enemy, and everything that is not consumed by the Muslim invader must be rendered unusable, end of quote. But Ibn Hazm replies to these currents that in his view, this is forbidden, and the domestic animals of the infidels may not even be harmed, except for the pigs, for those must all be killed. Now, although the foregoing reveals that for Ibn Hazm not everything is allowed in war, he nevertheless agrees that against the infidels themselves, practically anything is permitted. For example, as Arnaldez explains, Ibn Hazm maintains that, quote, the lives of women and children must be spared, at least when they are not fighting in the ranks with the men. If they are struck down in the course of a nighttime attack or unintentionally in the fray, there is no crime. Apart from these two exceptions, it is permitted to kill all infidels, whether combatants or not, merchants, hired servants, or common laborers, old men, peasants, bishops, priests or monks, the blind or the lame, without a single exception. Some authors cite various hadiths in favor of other exceptions. For example, they consider it lawful to spare old men, monks, and merchants. Ibn Hazm rejects them all, nor does he admit that the permission to kill is limited to combatants. As a justification for his thesis, he recalls the Prophet Muhammad's extermination of all the men in the Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayza, who were put to death without exception, while the women and the children were sold as slaves. End of quote. It is worth pointing out that Muhammad exterminated the Banu Qurayza after they had willingly surrendered to Muhammad, following his siege of their stronghold. Emphasizing this point, Ibn Hazm affirms that according to the Prophet Muhammad, it is even legal to kill a very old man whose mind no longer works very well if he never made Islam, quote unquote, which is to say, if he never submitted to Allah, thus converting to the true religion. The meaning of Islam, I have to remind you, in Islam, in English, the translation of the word Islam is submission. Okay, that's what it means. It's pretty clear, right? It's in the name. Now, war booty. I'm not going to be speaking much longer, but I started a little bit late, so I'm going to go on for a few minutes. War booty refers to that property of infidels which the Muslim army takes by force. Many Muslim scholars defended the view that in many cases, even if the property of a Muslim were found among the war booty, for example, a slave who had escaped to Dar al-Harb, this property should not be returned to the Muslim owner, but divided among the soldiers. That such an opinion should have been so widespread provokes Arnaldes to comment, quote, "This teaching is interesting because it shows the importance that the Muslims attributed to the division of booty among the soldiers over and above any other consideration." End of quote. Division of the booty is obviously a strong incentive for Muslims to wage war. But Ibn Hazm carefully points out that an infidel cannot legally own what was once the property of a Muslim, because he is a dirty infidel. And so the soldiers may not take another Muslim's property, another Muslim person's property, even should they find it among the war booty. As Arnaldes says, quote, "The very important thing about these indignant reactions is that Ibn Hazm affirms therein that only Muslim law counts, even when it is a question of non-Muslims," end of quote. Ibn Hazm obviously thought that many Muslim mercenaries were beyond the pale, but not because they were in the habit of murdering all infidel men and enslaving the women and children. He was in warm agreement with that. He thought many Muslim mercenaries of his time were beyond the pale because they took the property of Muslims found in the war booty. That's what was outrageous to Ibn Hazm. It is important to see this. The problem for Ibn Hazm was not that Muslim soldiers were genocidal, but corrupt. And here lay the decadence of medieval Muslim society that so disgusted Ibn Hazm. On the topic of lying to the infidels, Ibn Hazm defends the view that this is not a sin. Treaties and oaths with infidels have no validity and are made to be broken. What would be a sin against a Muslim is justified with an infidel because the defeat of infidels is the whole point of Islam. The jurist Abu Hanifa maintained that if an infidel in Dar al-Harb converted to Islam and stayed there until the Muslims conquered his country, he should remain a free man when the conquest happened and keep all of his movable property. His children, who were not yet of age, would also become automatically Muslims and keep their freedom. But the convert's land and the fetus in the womb of his wife, even though Muslim, is part of the war booty. So, sorry, because in Islamic law, it is permissible for a slave to be Muslim. And if the convert had migrated to Dar al-Islam, says Abu Hanifa, then everything he left behind becomes part of the war booty when the conquest happens and will be divided among the soldiers. The same happens if he first came to Dar al-Islam as an infidel and then submitted, with the difference that in this latter case, his children are not automatically Muslims and form part of the war booty. Ibn Hazm rejects all of Abu Hanifa's teachings because they do not produce the proper incentive for conversion to Islam. The laws must be designed so that infidels realize that the way to protect themselves from Muslim soldiers is to convert. So Ibn Hazm states that he who submits to Allah may keep his children and all his property, regardless of where he finds himself when the Muslims conquer his country. The exceptions are the wife and those children who are already adults. These may legitimately be considered part of the war booty, probably because, being adults, they may prove difficult to indoctrinate, and hence it is better to enslave them. This will suffice. The distance that existed between the very influential Ibn Hazm and his opponents does not allow us to say that any medieval jurist defended Islam as the religion of peace. Clearly, they were all agreed that Islam was the religion of war, and terrorist war at that. Here lay the ideological center of gravity. The reason is not far to seek. Muhammad was fond of exterminating infidels and in particular Jews. Hence, Islamic jurists in the Middle Ages disagreed only on just how much terrorist destruction it was lawful to apply, in the specific manner of it. It follows, therefore, that the opinion of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and not that of Pope Benedict XVI, Prince Charles of Wales, or President George W. Bush, is the one that best matches the medieval Islamic traditions. I'm going to be talking about this topic in other videos. We are not done talking about Islam, but I'm going to leave the topic here tonight. Obviously, when our Western authorities are telling us that Islam is the religion of peace and that violent Muslims are somehow distorting the original message of Islam, they're simply lying to us. Please read the Quran. Please read it. Not because I think you're going to find enlightenment in the Quran. Read it because you should know what is in it. There are now millions of Muslims in the West, and they are being taught at the mosque. And the text that is used at the mosque to tell Muslims what the world is and what they should do is the Quran. So go read it and convince yourself, for yourself, by yourself, whether or not it is possible to interpret the life of Muhammad and the teachings of Muhammad as constituting the religion of peace. Do it for yourself. Don't let other people tell you what this religion is. Thank you for joining us. Remember to subscribe and like. Remember to share, because the West is in danger and we need Westerners to fight for the future of their children and their grandchildren. We need them to reproduce, and we need them to fight for the Judeo-Christian values of the West. So please share, but also to help us with the algorithm, subscribe and like, and ding that bell so that you're always notified of our upcoming podcasts. Thank you very much.